name is Aaron Harris, and this is the history of psychology. I hope you enjoy. There's multiple videos throughout the presentation, along with worded explanations of each human who had an impact on psychology.
Psychology began to emerge as a field distinct from philosophy in the 19th century. Prior to this, philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes explored the causes of behavior and the nature of the mind. But in 1879, German physician Wilhelm Wundt established the first laboratory within the philosophy department at the University of Leipzig with the goal of applying the experimental methods of natural science to philosophical problems. Specifically, Wundt believed that he could understand the structure of the mind through introspection, close examination of one's own conscious experience. This school of thought became known as structuralism, as Wundt believed that introspection would eventually reveal the hidden structures of the mind. Even though it has been replaced with more objective measures, this work represents the beginning of psychology as a science, because it showed that mental processes could be quantified. Another important early psychologist was American William James. He built upon Charles Darwin's ideas about natural selection. Specifically, he proposed that much like our physical characteristics, human psychological characteristics evolved because they were functional. They provided some kind of evolutionary advantage. This school of thought became known as functionalism, and it was focused on understanding how specific mental processes helped people survive and adapt to their environment. These days, this work has evolved into a branch of study called evolutionary psychology, which attempts to explain psychological processes such as perception, language, and memory as being the product of evolutionary adaptation. Sigmund Freud is considered the father of psychoanalysis, or Freudian psychology, which focuses on the role of the unconscious in shaping behavior. Freud believed that behavior was driven by forgotten childhood experiences and unconscious desires. He developed psychoanalytic treatment approaches intended to treat psychological symptoms by bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness through the analysis of dreams and talk therapy. Freud's work also inspired other psychologists, such as Carl Jung, Erik Erikson, Alfred Adler, and Karen Horney. Each of these theorists shared Freud's beliefs about the importance of early childhood experiences, but they felt that Freud overemphasized certain factors, like sexual desires, and that he had an overly negative view of human nature. They began to explore other motivators, such as the drive to achieve or to build close connections. Many of Freud's ideas were not falsifiable and therefore not scientific. For example, it's not possible to test whether a person's behavior is influenced by an undetectable unconscious desire. As psychology developed, it became more scientific, and later schools of thought shifted away from psychoanalytic perspectives to focus on testable hypotheses about the causes of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Weeks of Famous Philosophers, a series where we're looking at a new famous philosopher every single day for the whole month of October. In this video, we'll be covering William James, founder of pragmatism, father of American psychology, and one of the most influential American philosophers of all time. Now, William James was an influential philosopher and psychologist. He was one of the founders of pragmatism, a theory of truth which attempted to answer some of the claims of skepticism. He also defended faith in his famous paper responding to William Clifford, The Will to Believe. We cover James frequently on the channel and already have videos both on his pragmatism and on his defense of faith. So we're just going to outline these subjects very briefly here and then encourage you to check out those videos if you are curious for more information. So, first off, William James was born in 1842 to a famous family, or at least a family that would become famous. His brother, Henry James, was the author of such famous works as The Turn of the Screw and The Portrait of a Lady. In fact, his sister was also an author as well. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the leader of the Transcendentalist movement, was his godfather. James's primary education was in medicine, and he actually had an MD. He eventually would go on to lecture in physiology at Harvard. And though he had no formal education in psychology or philosophy, he eventually became a lecturer in both of these fields. He reputedly said that the first psychology lecture he ever heard was the first one that he taught. A champion of functionalism in psychology, James founded the American Society for Psychical Research before his death in 1910. Now, James explained pragmatism as the resolution of the debate between tough-minded materialists and tender-minded idealists. James was a staunch opponent of the skeptic, claiming we should not doubt our basic beliefs until we have reason to do so. To James, the practical consequences, hence pragmatism, of our beliefs were more important than the philosophical justification for them. For more on this debate and many skeptical objections to James and his positions, check out my video on pragmatism as a theory of truth. Now, William Clifford famously argued that belief without evidence, such as religious faith, was not merely unjustified, but in fact unethical. James famously responded to this argument by claiming that there are certain situations in which we can ethically believe things that are unjustified, namely when the question is live, forced, and momentous. For more on this argument, check out my videos at the tail end of my series on modal logic on James and Clifford. Don't worry, you don't need all of the background in modal logic to get a good sense of that debate. Therefore, I give you William James, founder of pragmatism, father of American psychology, and one of the most influential American philosophers of all time, and one of my favorite philosophers to object to and argue with here. Next up, we are going to be covering Nietzsche himself. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org.
But psychology... It might seem like a weird thing to say, but psychology hasn't always existed. Psychology was invented. Prior to the 19th century, nobody had heard of psychology, because psychology didn't exist. So who was the genius who started it? Well, the world's first ever psychologist was a German scientist called Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt led the Leipzig laboratory in Germany and churned out hundreds of pieces of research, igniting the engine that grew into the huge discipline that we know today. At the time, Wundt was interested in psychophysiology. How does vision work? How about hearing? Physical senses in the mind. Some of Wundt's initial research questions continue to interest psychologists today, though our ability to measure and manipulate variables is significantly more sophisticated than was 2 centuries old. Germany's university system at the time of Wundt was already set up to favour a scientific approach, even in subjects that are typically considered to be the arts. So, whilst other countries' academics were philosophizing, Wundt was getting empirical. For Wundt, psychology was the science of immediate experience, and in order to measure this, he trained people to be self-observers. The approach was called structuralism. Technique was introspection, literally to look within oneself. And Wundt's introspectionists were required to observe stimuli and then describe their experiences. Against modern standards, Wundt's research is barely scientific, and there are countless examples of introspectionists not agreeing on exactly what they're observing, or lengthy delays between the initial experience and the subsequent recording of the experience. However, Wundt's research inspired the birth of a new discipline, so we ought not to be too harsh on his rookie errors. Psychology developed as a science through a series of phases, each rejecting something about the phase that came before it. Wundt's structuralism was superseded by functionalism, which really took root in America. Whereas structuralists were interested in the components of consciousness, what makes up our conscious mind, functionalists thought that the focus should be on the processes of the conscious mind. And so the study shifted to studying behaviours instead of the hidden mental components. Perhaps the most famous functionalist was William James, who said, "My thinking is first, last, and always for the sake of my doing." Therefore, the theory followed, study what I do to understand what I think. Subsequent schools of psychology are wide-ranging, from evolutionary psychology to Freud's psychodynamic theory, and then onto behavioralism, led by such giants as John Watson and Ivan Pavlov. By the middle of the 20th century, psychology had taken a new change in direction in what is now called the cognitive revolution. Cognitive psychology returned psychology to the study of hidden mental processes rather than focusing on behavioural expressions of these processes. And more recently yet, the biological revolution launched into force towards the end of the 20th century as our ability to observe the brain in action was liberated by huge developments in measuring tools such as brain scanners. So today, we find ourselves surrounded by all manner of different psychological specialisms: neuroscience, social psychology, environmental psychology, behavioral, cognitive, occupational psychology, gestalt psychology, psychodynamics, humanistic psychology. There are so many more. All of them have Wilhelm Wundt to thank. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. If you